The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. Some people think that this wording opens the door to something else. Specifically, that it opens the door to giants, to Nephilim, being part of end times biblical prophecy. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man.
Dr. Michael Heiser explains the return of the Nephilim and where this originates from. And recently I reacted to a Chuck Missler's video about the return of the Nephilim. I want to get a different perspective from Dr. Michael Heiser and what he thinks is actually going on here in Matthew chapter 24 and Genesis chapter 6. So let's get right into it, guys. This is fascinating stuff.
The Old Testament of the Bible includes several stories about ancient giants. Goliath, of course, his battle with David is the most familiar. But Genesis 6, 1 through 4 tells us there were giants long before David and Goliath. Those verses read as follows: When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now there are some key wordings in this passage, which is situated sometime before the great biblical flood, which is Genesis 6 through 9. The first is Nephilim. Now this word can mean giants and was certainly taken that way by ancient translators of the Old Testament. For example, the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, has gigantes, giants, in this verse. The second wording in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 to note is the comment that there were giants before the flood and, quote, also afterward, unquote. The Bible, of course, describes some of these. The most famous, again, is Goliath. But there are also others, Og and the Rephaim in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, and the Anakim in Numbers 13.
When I read about the Rephaim and then the Akaim and then the giants and Nephilim in Joshua's time, I was like, when you're reading, you think that the flood was supposed to destroy all of these species. But here they are in the Bible again. What is up with that? But I'm fascinated to know if he thinks that what Jesus is talking about, the return of the days of Noah, is that's referencing the Nephilim again.
Some people think that this wording opens the door to something else. Specifically, that it opens the door to giants, to Nephilim, being part of end times biblical prophecy. Now, why would someone make that leap? Why argue such a point? And is the claim valid? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today in this episode of Fringe Pop 321. Now, we're talking about why it is that some Bible students and those who are just sort of more conspiratorially minded insist that the biblical end times will include a return of the Nephilim. The short answer is Matthew 24. This is referred to as the Olivet Discourse by theologians and Bible scholars. And that chapter of the Gospel of Matthew is typically the launching point for this idea. In that passage, Jesus, when asked by his disciples to divulge when the climactic events of the end would occur, replied in part, quote, But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Well, that's Matthew 24, 36 through 39, roughly, in the ESV.
So what in the world is happening here, guys? Is this just a foreshadowing of people just being evil all over the land, eating, drinking, living their lives But the marriage part is fascinating, and he's going to dive deep into it here.
Now, I'm guessing that you can see already why this passage is used for the Nephilim return thesis, again, coming back in the end times. Matthew 24 compares the end of days with the days of Noah and mentions marrying and giving in marriage. That last phrase, marrying and giving in marriage, supposedly points directly to Genesis 6:2, where we read, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose." Now, if that's the case, so the argument goes, we ought to expect more Nephilim in the end times. Again, that's the argument. So this is what we need to think about as we proceed. The evidence for the claim that Nephilim will return in the last days seems strong, given the apparent parallel between Matthew 24 and Genesis 6.
So he's saying that it's a strong possibility. I've been getting some comments saying that Nephilim are here already. The city of angels, Los Angeles. Basketball players, 7 feet tall. What is going on? Or now we've been finding the tridactyl creatures in Peru, the 3 fingers and alien-looking heads. What is going on there? I would love to know what you guys think in the comments for sure.
But the similarity is actually more surface than substance. Let's ask ourselves a question. If Jesus had wanted his listeners to think of Genesis 6:1 through 4, or Matthew had wanted his readers to think of Genesis 6:1 through 4, would it not make sense, wouldn't it be reasonable, that we would find quotations of Genesis 6:1 through 4 in Matthew 24? Now you're probably wondering, why are you even asking? Isn't that what we just read? Doesn't Matthew quote Genesis 6:2 in his marrying and giving in marriage line, giving us the context for the days of Noah in Matthew's gospel? Well, it sure looks that way in English. The problem is that the New Testament wasn't written in English. It was written in Greek. And Matthew would be quite capable of quoting the Greek translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, if he wanted readers to think of Genesis 6:1 through 4.
Wow. What a plot twist. Is he saying that he wasn't even referencing the Nephilim?
That's what you would do. So that means we need to ask ourselves the question in a different way. If Jesus or Matthew wanted listeners and readers to think of Genesis 6:2, and Matthew actually doesn't quote it, what do we have then? Now, I think it's perfectly reasonable, again, to defend the idea of Nephilim in the end times using Matthew 24, to expect a quotation. You wouldn't quote anything else if you were trying to make the point, and so if we don't have the quotation, we've got something else. Turns out all we need to do to know conclusively which direction this is going to go, does Matthew in fact quote the Greek translation of the Old Testament in his Greek gospel or not, it's very easy to find out. All we need to do is set side by side the Greek of Matthew 24 in the relevant places with the Greek of the Septuagint from Genesis 6:1 through 4, right next to it. And this is what you're looking at on the screen. Whether you can read the Greek or not, you can actually see what the answer is. You can.
Oh, wow. We're reading Genesis 2:6 here. And the sons of God, having seen the daughters of humankind, and they were beautiful, took for themselves women from all whom they chose. Ooh. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. I don't know. Seems similar, but I didn't see anything about, sons of God in there.
Verdict. All you need to do is visually see if the words are the same. And you can visually see that, no, they're not. The Greek of Matthew 24 is different than the Greek of Genesis 6:1 through 4. And the implication, therefore, is obvious. Matthew is not quoting Genesis 6:2 when he gives us his marrying and giving in marriage line. And that should tell us that Matthew was not thinking of Genesis 6:2 in what he wrote, because if he was, it would stand to reason that he would actually quote the passage.
So why did he say in the days of Noah? He's still referencing in Genesis, in the days of Noah. So that's interesting.
Consequently, Matthew 24:36 through 39 isn't about a return of the Nephilim or a repetition of what happened in Genesis 6:2. Aside from not quoting the Greek text of Genesis 6:2 on Matthew's part, there are other problems with the way Matthew 24:36 through 39 is used to defend the idea of a Nephilim return. If Matthew was really referencing Genesis 6:1 through 4, there's something else that you would not expect him to do. Specifically, you would not expect Matthew to insert additional details for the days of Noah, details that are never mentioned in Genesis 6:1 through 4. Because again, if that's the passage he's thinking of, he knows where to find it in his Old Testament, and he could just as well quote it for what it says, and now not insert more details that aren't there. Because if you inserted other details, that would sort of confuse your reader. You wouldn't know if he was really wanting you to think about Genesis 6:1 through 4. It just wouldn't make sense. Now, here's Matthew's list of what was going on in, quote, the days of Noah. Eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, and not watching or being unaware of what was going on. Only one of those three items could be associated with Genesis 6:1 through 4, in theory, the marrying and giving in marriage part.
Right.
But as we've seen above, Matthew isn't actually drawing his vocabulary from the Greek translation of Genesis 6:2. So even that correlation is, of course, misguided. The other items in Matthew 24 that Matthew actually does have listed have no association with the supernatural or angelic aspects of Genesis 6:1 through 4.
I think, though, that this is more the conservative side of looking at things, which is probably right. Like, wasn't the whole point of destroying the Nephilim so they don't return again? Like, that's the whole idea. But obviously, Jesus is planning on returning, and we will get to a very evil, wicked state.
Not there. So why would we, as modern readers or interpreters, impose the supernatural character of Genesis 6:1 through 4 onto what Matthew says when A, he doesn't quote it, and B, he adds details that aren't in the Genesis 6 passage.
Right.
The activities of eating and drinking and not watching or being unaware are completely human. Again, we don't need angels or sons of God for any of that. They have nothing to do with visitors from heaven and the kind of context that Genesis 6:2 gives us. Insisting that Matthew 24 align with Genesis 6:1 through 4 is therefore pretty arbitrary. The interpretation lacks coherence. Lastly, there's one more reason to not expect Nephilim in the end times. The idea actually runs completely contrary to the Bible's own accounting of the giants, the descendants of the Nephilim, or the Nephilim that were on earth after the flood. According to the Old Testament, the last of the giants were killed off in the time of David. This, of course, is Goliath, but it also includes his brothers. Beyond.
Wow. I am so surprised this is the take that Michael Heiser is representing. But I respect it because he's going back to the Greek and actually reading what it says, not just reading it from the English perspective. You know, this is what I love about Michael Heiser, is because he understands Greek and Hebrew, at least from a textual criticism, and it helps us to understand what were they talking about, what were they writing about.
David's time, there are no more giants in the biblical storyline. So while the idea might make a good movie, it doesn't make good biblical interpretation.
That's fascinating. So shout out to French Pop 321 for posting that video of Dr. Michael Heiser. What an inspiration. So at the end of the day, we have no one to blame but for ourselves for how we react, how we behave. Are we following God? Are we ready to live a life holy and pleasing to God? Or are we living in sin? Are we living in sin, doing our own thing, living a life full of debauchery and evilness and wickedness? Or are we turning to Jesus? And that's what we need to do, is hold ourselves accountable. We need to go to Jesus. So guys, if you've never decided to trust in Jesus and put your faith in him, I encourage you to do that today. It will be the best decision you could ever make. I promise you guys, you will not be disappointed. He will always be with you through the hard times, through the difficult times. I encourage you to do that today. In the description below, you will be able to click a link to help you to decide to follow Jesus for the first time. Do that today.